Imagine walking down a street you've known your entire life, looking at the familiar brick walls and the ordinary buildings of your city. But then you look closer at the ground level. You notice windows half buried in the dirt, ornate stone carvings disappearing into the pavement, and grand entrances that are now nothing more than basement vents. Does it ever feel like the proportions are just wrong? What if I told you that you aren't actually standing on the ground floor? What if I told you that the world you know is built directly on top of a global civilization that was systematically erased from our history books? The official story says these are just sanitation projects or flood prevention from the 1800s. They tell us that 19th century builders with nothing but horse-drawn carts and hand shovels decided to lift entire cities because the mud was a bit too thick. Does that sound like the truth to you? Or does it sound like a cover-up for a global catastrophe that changed everything? Let's look at the evidence that is staring us in the face every single day. In photograph after photograph from the mid-1800s, we see the same impossible feature. Across dozens of major cities, architectural masterpieces are shown with their ground floors submerged in the earth. We see elaborate stonework cut off at street level as if the buildings were pushed down into the dirt by a giant hand. Standard architectural history tells us this is nothing controversial. They say streets were simply raised for drainage and flood control. Except when you look closer, that explanation starts to fracture. Because these aren't crude first floors that were buried. These are architectural masterpieces. Buildings with basement windows more elaborate than most modern buildings' main entrances. Stonework that required master craftsmen. And all of it, according to the standard timeline, was built specifically to be buried almost immediately. Why would anyone do that? Why would a society spend millions of dollars to build subterranean grandeur only to entomb it under 5 meters of mud? Let's start with what we can observe directly. In Seattle, an entire district lies beneath the current street level. In Chicago, miles of tunnels connect buried first floors. In Edinburgh, whole streets exist underground, complete with storefronts and residential spaces. Standard urban archaeology calls this gradual accumulation, except the timeline is completely wrong. These aren't ancient ruins buried by centuries of time. These are sophisticated 19th century structures buried within decades of their construction, in some cases within years. Buildings appear in photographs as street-level structures, then reappear 20 years later half submerged with no documentation of why or how the streets rose several meters. The deeper you look, the more the pattern repeats, not just in America or Europe, but worldwide. In Asia, in South America, in Africa, cities separated by vast oceans supposedly developed independently, yet they all show the same architectural signature, the same buried windows, the same half-submerged ground floors, the absence of documentation explaining why functional buildings were deliberately entombed. Consider how rarely these patterns are examined together. Each city's buried architecture is treated as a local curiosity, never connected to the global phenomenon. The strangest part isn't just that buildings were buried. The strange part is the architecture itself. These buried levels weren't simple basement floors. They were primary entrances. They were elaborate public spaces. And according to the official narrative, they were all designed and built knowing they'd be buried almost immediately. That's not how construction works. That's not how economics works. This is where the concept of Tartaria enters the investigation, not as a definitive answer, but as a framework for organizing these anomalies. Around the same period, in the 1800s, architectural patterns shifted dramatically worldwide. Suddenly, cities everywhere began constructing buildings with nearly identical design principles. Not similar, identical. The same proportions, the same structural logic, the same ornamental vocabulary. Could these buildings represent inherited technology? Architecture built according to design principles and construction techniques that weren't invented but rediscovered. Structures that might have been completed, occupied briefly, then partially buried during some unrecorded cataclysm. First, consider the photographs. In city after city, historical photographs show buildings at different ground levels than they stand today. Differences of 3, 4, sometimes 6 meters. Yet no documentation explaining why this happened is consistently absent or inadequate. No comprehensive engineering plans survive for most cities. No detailed cost accounting. No contemporary newspaper coverage proportional to what would have been massive infrastructure undertakings. Why is the silence so deafening? Second, look at the structural engineering of the buildings themselves. Many feature support columns that terminate at what is now underground, as if they were designed for a different elevation. Ventilation systems positioned below ground that would have been functional only if the street level were lower. Third, the buried spaces themselves. When you access them, you find something remarkable. Not crude storage areas, but fully realized architectural spaces, finished walls, decorative elements. And here is where it becomes impossible to ignore. The material burying these structures isn't urban accumulation, it's meters of mud, sand, and clay deposited rapidly. Geological layers that suggest catastrophic deposition, not slow urban development. In some locations, the buried levels show signs of having been flooded, filled with sediment, then abandoned suddenly. Now we arrive at the central mystery. How did dozens of cities across multiple continents decide to raise their street levels within the same narrow time window? The conventional answer involves the Industrial Revolution and pattern books, but that explanation requires transition periods. You don't see them. The architecture appears mature from its first documented instances. The construction techniques show no learning curve. The standardization appears immediately, not progressively. Consider the technology itself. These buildings feature advanced structural engineering and iron frameworks. All of this supposedly emerged simultaneously across the world in the hands of builders who had no prior experience with such techniques. We observe uniformity. Buildings in San Francisco that could stand in St. Petersburg without looking out of place. Structures in Melbourne that share design DNA with structures in Montreal. This suggests something else, not independent innovation, but coordinated implementation of existing designs, as if builders worldwide were working from the same master plans. Here's what makes this truly disturbing: the documentary gaps. For such massive transformations, you'd expect comprehensive records, engineering surveys, municipal minutes, contractor agreements. Some of this exists, but far less than you'd expect. Dates don't align. Project descriptions are vague. It's as if the official documentation was created after the fact, filling in a narrative to explain changes that had already occurred for undocumented reasons. The silence is deafening. Why would such significant projects leave so little trace? Why would transformative technologies appear without development histories? The simplest answer is that the documentation was never created because the changes weren't planned in the way we're told. The alternative answer, darker and more difficult, is that records existed and were deliberately removed. Look at the precision of the buried structures. The joints in the stonework are tight beyond what hand tools should achieve. The load-bearing walls show engineering calculations that shouldn't exist without modern structural analysis. The heating systems alone are remarkable. Complex networks of air ducts and thermal distribution systems. They appear in buildings dated decades before such systems were supposed to be invented. The evidence suggests these weren't learning exercises. These were mature applications of advanced knowledge, which raises the critical question, where did that knowledge come from? The pattern is visible if you are willing to look. Within a relatively brief period, sometime in the late 19th century, functional architectural systems disappeared worldwide. The buildings were entombed beneath raised streets. The documentation was either never created or removed. An alternative narrative was constructed, explaining the existing architecture as newly built rather than inherited, describing the buried levels as intentional basements. This wasn't accidental. The consistency across cities suggests coordination. If there was a civilization that built these structures and then vanished from the record, you'd expect exactly what we observe today. Inherited buildings used without full understanding, sudden burial and replacement with simpler systems, collective amnesia about what came before. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Stand in one of these buried spaces if you get the chance. Feel the stonework, observe the proportions, and then ask yourself, does this feel like a basement, or does it feel like we are living in the attic? That is the unsettling implication, that what we call ground level might actually be the second story, that what we call progress might be recovery from regression. Advanced architectural systems were entombed beneath our cities. Technological capabilities were lost or suppressed. Historical narratives were constructed that don't match the physical evidence. Why? That is the question that haunts this investigation. Was it a catastrophe? Some event that deposited meters of sediment rapidly? Was it deliberate concealment to construct new historical narratives? The answer matters, because if we are living amid the remains of more advanced systems, then our assumptions about human progress need revision. The trajectory isn't inevitably upward. Knowledge can be lost. I started this investigation with curiosity about Victorian construction. I'm ending it with fundamental questions about historical continuity. How much of our technological progress is recovery rather than invention? The buried windows suggest answers we are not comfortable considering. The missing records point to a deliberate obscuring of those answers. Walk down any city street today. Look at the basement windows. Notice how the architecture terminates at the sidewalk. And ask yourself, was this designed to be seen from below ground? The evidence is everywhere, buried beneath our feet, waiting to be recognized for what it represents. Not basements, not sanitation projects, but inheritance. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed. The question is what we are walking on top of and what we lost when we buried it. If you're ready to look beneath the surface, stay tuned. The truth is deeper than you think.